Davrin's palms found stones slick with blood. The liquid still seemed to be carrying some level of warmth. His fingers pressed into cracks, worn smooth by 10,000 years of similar struggles, seeking purchase where countless hands had gripped before his. The carapace armor scraped across rock as he pushed upward, ceramite grinding against stone with a sound that settled into his teeth. Pain lanced through his ribs. His legs shook badly, the tremor starting deep in his thighs, where enhanced muscle had burned through every chemical enhancement that had been given to him. Each upward step required conscious attention, his body operating on nothing but conditioning. The combat drugs had left his nervous system raw, every sensation arriving unfiltered and sharp. Cold leaked through his armor's damaged seals, settling into the spaces where his body heat couldn't find insulation. He had been blasted in a crater which now rose above him. His hands found new holds, pulled his weight upward another half-meter, stopped while his legs remembered how to support him. His breath came short inside his helmet, the recycled air tasting of copper and his own sweat. Somewhere around him, 9 of his brothers lay in permanent sleep, lives given to the cause they had been born to fight. The loss was heavy, but he didn't look back. Looking back meant seeing Vaughn in 2 pieces, Torvus's absence, Lenz's body, and Kale's confusion frozen on his face. His elite conditioning had taught his hands where to find holds, his body how to distribute weight, his mind how to process tactical situations. But it hadn't taught him how to stand when standing made no sense, when the only certainty was death, and tactics offered no solutions. He was now running on vapor and muscle memory. His armor showed cracks across the chest plate where impacts had nearly punched through. The ceramite's protection revealed as temporary, insufficient, failed. The gun hanging from its sling had a few rounds from a charge pack he'd found in the crater. A few rounds against Chaos Marines whose armor had survived millennia, against a demon prince whose wings cast shadows that swallowed light, against forces that numbered more and more with every passing minute. The ratio remained broken, advantages still inadequate. But Cadia had held for 10,000 years through broken ratios and impossible odds. The phrase lived in his bones, written there by years under the eye's violet gaze, by childhood spent learning to shoot before learning to read, by watching his mother take position at their window while demons manifested 3 streets distant. The planet broke before the guard did. Simple fact, proven across centuries when Black Crusades crashed against walls that refused to yield despite every tactical reason to collapse, every mathematical certainty promising defeat. Davrin's hand crested the crater's rim, his fingers digging into stone. He pulled his weight over the edge, legs threatening to fail as he stood fully upright. The killing field spread before him through smoke that moved against the wind. Corpses and wreckage stretched toward a horizon, gone violet and thin. Fires burning with the odd colors of chaos. The smell hit him through his cracked seal, promethium mixing with cooked meat, underneath that something sharp and wrong that made his throat want to close. Vaughn's power sword still lay beside his fingers. The sergeant's top half had fallen with his arm extended, reaching towards something or someone in that final moment. Davrin bent slowly, his injured ribs grinding together as he folded at the waist. His hands found Vaughn's fingers, cold now but still holding that perfect grip. He pried them open one by one, feeling resistance as tendons stiff with cold refused to yield. The fingers gave way finally, reluctant, releasing their burden into Davrin's palm. The power sword's weight settled heavier than it looked, the grip worn smooth by Vaughn's hand over 2 decades. Davrin's fingers found impressions left by his sergeants, slight depressions where calluses had compressed the material. The blade's power cell showed minimal charge through a display half obscured by dried blood. 3 activations, maybe 4 if he was careful. 3 swings before it became an ordinary metal weapon, the monomolecular edge going inert. 3 swings was more than he would likely have the opportunity to use, but it was comforting to have the tool if it was needed. Davrin Mag locked the sword to his thigh plate, feeling the weapon's weight pull at the connection point with each small movement. His lasgun remained slung across his chest, its power pack indicator pulsing amber, 6 shots and 3 swings, his weapons both nearly depleted. But they were what he carried, so they were what he'd use until they stopped working or he stopped moving. Overhead, the will of eternity hung like a watchful eye. It suggested an impending death, but he would meet that death standing, on his feet rather than cowering, moving toward it rather than away, weapon in his hands and brother's blood drying on his armor, and the knowledge that he'd chosen this. No orders compelled him, no discipline forced him, no hope of survival motivated him. Just the simple fact of being Cadian on a world that bred soldiers like other worlds bred wheat. Davrin turned toward the muster field, toward sounds of Acanthos roaring and defenders screaming. His legs carried him forward despite their shaking, despite exhaustion that blurred his vision at the edges. One foot found purchase on stone, then the other, his body remembering how to walk, even as his mind tried to anticipate what waited ahead. As he moved from the crater and walked out onto the streets of the fortress, he passed the signs of war. Machines burned from broken hulls, and the bodies of both Chaos and Cadian were strewn through streets he had called home for many years. The fighting could be heard in the distance, but in these streets, where the assault had already passed, there was an odd level of silence. The only other moving things were strangling bands of guardsmen. Some, like Davrin, moved towards the sounds of the fight. Others were shamelessly moving in the other direction. He couldn't blame them, but he didn't respect them. As he made his way through the streets towards the center of the fortress, he could see flames and smoke up ahead. It wasn't long until the main fortress came into view, and it was ablaze. Flames licked the air as smoke rolled against the wind, carrying smells that made Davrin's very aware that his helmet's filters were failing. He moved to the gates that had been torn open through brute force and heavy firepower. Other broken groups of guardsmen were doing the same, brave men and women who had decided to fight for their home despite the odds. Inside, Davrin found walkways and paths that had been made familiar by 3 months of daily watches. Routes he could walk blind, now transformed into his battlefield. As he moved closer to the fighting bodies lined his path. Kasirkin mostly, their armor cracked and rent, sea eagle brands on their necks, standing dark against skin going pale as blood cooled and drained. Davrin recognized faces behind shattered visors, new names that would never answer roll call. Trooper Hadrus from the first wave, his chest showing the puncture marks where bolt rounds had found the gaps in his armor. Sergeant Kellen's entire squad was down within 5 meters of each other, 8 bodies arranged in a pattern that told the story of their last 30 seconds. Wounded helping wounded, the final 2 back to back, until chain axes found them. His boots found purchase between them, stepping carefully around hands still gripping lasguns, over legs that had stopped working mid-stride. He bent to pick up spare charge packs and kept moving. He couldn't afford to stop. Stopping meant his mind would process what his eyes were showing him, would calculate how many of these bodies he'd known, how many had shared rations or stood watches beside him. That processing risked breaking him. Fleeing guardsmen rushed past in scattered groups, their boots hammering stone in pattering rhythms. Young faces under helmets, purple eyes wide and unfocused, professional discipline shattered into animal panic. Some still clutched their guns while running, muscle memory refusing to release weapons even as conscious minds chose flight. Others had dropped everything, sprinting with hands empty and reaching. Davrin felt no judgment watching them go. These soldiers had stood their watches faithfully for 8 days, had fired until their barrels glowed, and had held positions because gaps needed filling. They'd stood as long as they could stand. He'd almost joined them back in that crater, almost dropped his own lasgun and ran. The shame of that near choice walked beside him, like weight he couldn't shed. He moved through a stone corridor that began to widen, opening onto a courtyard where the fighting intensified. At the end of the corridor, heat began to wash over him in waves as Orcanthos moved through defenders 50 meters from his position. His demon wings spread wide enough to brush walls on both sides, fanning warmth outward. Davrin's body pressed against rubble automatically, seeking cover while his eyes tracked the demon prince's movements. Those claws dripped blood that hissed as it fell to the stone, eating into the very rock. A battle sister died while Davrin watched, the demon's talon punching through her power armor's chestplate and emerging from her back. Her bolter fell from hands, her body going limp as Orcanthos lifted her overhead like a trophy before casting her aside. The demon prince's laughter made Davrin's teeth ache, vibration settling into his jaw and spreading through his skull. Purple light from the eye overhead painted everything in violet shades. Reality warped visible around Orcanthos, making it hard to look directly at the beast for too long. Davrin kept moving, low and quick around the courtyard, toward where he could hear guardsmen fighting nearby, using rubble for cover. Everything in his body told him not to move toward Orcanthos. Alone, he could do nothing but attract the creature's attention. His armor scraped against stone as he pressed himself low, the sound sharp in his ears as he hoped the demon wouldn't hear him. Vaughn's power sword swung at his thigh with each step, its weight pulling at the maglock connection. The grip pressed against his leg through his armor, 1 foot forward, then another. The muster field lay perhaps 300 meters ahead, through corridors that had become a maze of fire and combat. Davrin's legs shook badly enough that he stopped every 10 meters, pressing his shoulder against walls still standing, breathing through his helmet's cracked seal. As he waited, he watched. Targets presented themselves. His training logged them, calculated firing solutions, estimated threat levels through processes that had become automatic over a decade of service. Occasionally he would fire at a lone cultist or two, dropping them before moving to his next piece of cover, never drawing attention of larger groups or Chaos Marines. Each step forward now required conscious effort rather than automatic motion. His body was protesting against pain and exhaustion. His mind tried to convince him that stopping would feel better, that rest was earned, that he'd done enough. The juvenile treatments that should have kept him operating were now showing their limits. They slowed aging, but couldn't manufacture energy from nothing. Behind him came sounds of the Cregan gates continuing to fall, the distinctive bark of bolt rounds, each impact a wet crack as mass reactive shells found a body. Chain axes shrieking through the air, clashing against whatever was in reach of their wielder. Above this war, reality was warping with sounds and lights that left people feeling uneasy. Davrin's voxcoms were still dead as he moved toward the location he hoped would regroup him with the main defensive force. His compact severed antenna had left him isolated from tactical updates that might have given him a fighting chance of reaching anyone. He moved around an inner fortress wall, pulling back behind rubble and cover as he approached the muster field's eastern approach. Davrin's hands tightened on his lasgun automatically, muscle memory preparing for whatever chaos waited. His ribs ground together with the movement, pain sharp enough to cause him to flinch momentarily. Vaughn's power sword pulled at his thigh plate, and he checked the connection instinctively. Maglock holding, power cell still showing those 3 precious activations, ready for swings that would probably be the last thing he'd do. He expected to die in the muster field, expected to fire his shots and draw Vaughn's blade and make whatever stand he could manage before bolt rounds or chain axes or demon fire ended him. No hope of survival, no tactical advantage, no reason to believe the next few minutes concluded anyway, except with his body joining the thousands already cooling across Kasserkraft's stones. But he kept walking anyway, one foot in front of the other, towards certain death and whatever small difference a lone man could make. 1 foot forward into smoke that moved against wind, through heat carrying corruption underneath its warmth, past bodies that had been brothers and defenders. The muster field waited ahead, and Davrin walked toward it like a man approaching a cliff's edge. Davrin's boots found the muster field's edge a large clearing near the middle of the fortress, stone giving way to ground so carpeted with bodies that clear footing required careful placement. His weight settled onto armor plates half buried in blood, the ceramite shifting under him, with sounds that made his stomach lurch. Kasurkin and standard guardsmen lay tangled together. The bodies still carried warmth in places, heat steaming into the cold air, invisible wisps that smelled of iron. Fires were burning across various points around the field, and smoke rolled across the place in waves that moved against the wind. 20 meters ahead, a colonel from the 252nd stood on an overturned chimera, his voice cracking as he bellowed orders that disappeared into surrounding chaos. A sorry-looking group were using the chimera as cover, firing on cultists pouring through a gap in the wall on the far side of the field. Davrin watched other guardsmen run past the officer without acknowledging his existence, their faces showing terror that transcended expression into something approaching catatonia. Purple eyes too wide, mouths open but making no sound, hands gripping guns they'd forgotten how to use. The colonel's voice broke mid-shout, falling into a coughing that sounded wet. He continued anyway, through what might have been blood in his throat. A bolt, pistols blam, cut through the broader chaos, sharp and authoritative. Davrin's gaze found the commissar a few meters from the overturned chimera, his weapon smoking after executing a fleeing trooper. The body fell forward, the hole in its back wide enough to see through. A handful more soldiers kept running towards Davrin while the corpse hit stone, the summary execution accomplishing nothing except adding to the chaos. The commissar raised his pistol toward another deserter. This time he hesitated, and then lowered it, as if understanding that shooting wouldn't do anything to stop the others from running for their lives. Some rally attempts were more successful, and pockets of resistance were banding together to cover different angles of the field where the enemy were starting to trickle through from side paths and holes in the walls. Davrin's boots carried him forward, past an officer trying to assemble a firing line from scattered guardsmen. 20 soldiers clustered around the lieutenant, their las guns raised, faces showing determination and defiance. Defensive positions were being hastily made where resources were available. Sandbag walls assembled from scattered equipment, overturned vehicles dragged into makeshift cover, ammunition crates stacked to provide firing positions. Davrin passed an Aegis barrier someone had built with care, its placement showing good tactical understanding, good angles, overlapping fields of fire, proximity to cover. This was abandoned now, the heavy bolter still mounted, but unmanned, its barrel cold. Through breaks in the shifting smoke, Chaos Marines were starting to show themselves advancing across the field's western edge, their corrupted armor moving with patient confidence that came from knowing victory had become within reach. Davrin's enhanced vision tracked their approach even through smoke and distance. Berserkers of the Hounds of Abaddon led the advance. Behind them came standard traitor marines, their bolters barking volleys at defenders who were caught in the open. A few demon engines were bounding forward on blade limbs, casting everything in orange light mixing with violet wash from overhead. They looked unstoppable, given the state of the defenders. The thought settled harshly into Davrin's mind. There were thousands of years of experience in some of those warriors, and they were making their way towards that overturned chimera, where a small pocket of defenders fired into the smoke and dust. It wasn't long before that defensive line broke. Not everywhere at once. Here and there, groups still fired, small groups holding positions that would soon be overrun. But the broader structure dissolved, discipline that had sustained 8 days of siege finally shattering under combined weight of demon presence and imminent annihilation. Davrin kept moving across the field in the direction of familiar lasfire, Imperial lasfire. Boots still found purchase between bodies, using whatever cover remained. As he moved across the eastern edge, he began to see a line forming. Soldiers were manning heavy weapons and building barricades along the eastern edge of the muster field, where slight elevation gave tactical advantage and rubble provided decent cover. These were not scattered troops or a rally attempt that would dissolve under pressure. This was an actual defensive line, organized and deliberate, soldiers taking positions with movements suggesting formal orders and leadership. The pattern showed structure, spacing correct, firing lanes established, heavy weapons positioned to lock down firing lanes. At the center stood a man Davrin didn't recognize, but whose uniform marked him as a major. Even through smoke and 200 meters, Davrin could see the stocky figure, a cigar clamped between teeth, visible as orange ember in violet light. Twin pistols hung at his belt, their grips worn smooth by hands that had commanded across decades. Davrin recognized the man standing by the major. Color Sergeant Oren Hector stood beside him, holding the Cadian Eighth's colors high, despite wind that tried to tear them from his grip. The banner showed scorch marks and lash burns, tears that had been field repaired with threads still visible, edges tattered from 8 days of constant display. But the aquila remained clear, the regimental insignia bright against fabric that had drunk smoke until the original colors showed only in protected folds. The major's voice carried across the field, cutting through chaos with authority that made Davrin's body respond before his mind processed the words. Not shouting, but projecting, each syllable clear and certain, tone absolutely confident despite everything burning around him. Guardsmen responded, standard shock troopers with M36 las guns and flak armor showing damage from 8 days of continuous use. They moved to positions the major indicated, dragging Aegis barriers from wreckage, hauling heavy weapons into firing positions, forming lanes of interlocking fire with precision, speaking to doctrine drilled into them since White Shields. The line took shape as Davrin watched, his boots carrying him forward through bodies and smoke. Soldiers appeared from rubble to take positions that made no tactical sense, that couldn't be defended against what approached, but they took them anyway, because the major commanded it, because Hector stood there with colors raised, because sometimes soldiers needed someone to tell them where to die so they could stop running and face it standing. The major's words reached Davrin across distance, tone clear even when specific syllables dissolved into the broader chaos, commanding as if victory remained possible, as if they hadn't just watched the Cregan gates fall and professional discipline shatter, as if defiance mattered when probability promised annihilation in minutes. Davrin's legs carried him forward, one step at a time toward that line. His hands stayed steady on his gun, despite the shaking in his legs, despite pain grinding through his ribs with each breath. The planet would break before the guard did. The Major stood 50 meters ahead now, close enough that details emerged through smoke and violet light. The cigar clamped between his teeth glowed orange, a small ember of normalcy in the smoke-strewn air. Davris was close enough now to see that the man's uniform bore scorch marks across the left shoulder, las burns that had been field-patched with thread still visible, the stitching uneven, like it had been done quickly between engagements. Hector stood beside him, holding the Cadian Eighth's colors. The banner stretched taut, despite wind that tried to tear it from his grip. The fabric showed its history, burns that had melted holes through the weave, edges tattered and frayed, repairs visible, where someone had stitched rips closed with whatever thread they could find. The aquila remained clear despite everything, its gold thread dulled by smoke, but still catching light. The regimental insignia stood bright against fabric that had drunk so much promethium and ash. The original colors showed only in protected folds. Blood stained the lower third, dried to brown, spatters telling stories about who'd fallen while carrying it. Guardsmen continued to move to positions the Major indicated, their movements showing the discipline that came from being drilled since they were white shields, despite the terror Davrin could see in how they held themselves. One soldier's helmet bore a dent across the left side, deep enough that the ceramite had cracked, the inner padding visible through the breach. Another's flak armor had lost its right pauldron entirely, the straps dangling loose, his shoulder showing through torn uniform beneath. Their guns carried the wear of constant firing, barrels scorched dark, stocks showing impact damage where they'd been used as clubs, power packs that had been recharged so many times the connection points had started to wear. Two guardsmen hauled a section of barricade that had been half melted by plasma fire, its surface warped and bubbled. The protective coating burned away to bare metal beneath. They positioned it anyway, bracing it with rubble, creating cover that might stop heavier gunfire if they were lucky. Davrin watched a young guardsman, couldn't have been more than 16, barely past White Shield, struggle with an ammunition crate too heavy for him to lift alone. Another soldier moved to help, their hands finding holds on opposite sides, lifting together. They set it down beside the autocannon, both soldiers breathing hard, their faces slick with sweat that cut lines through ash and smoke residue. The younger one's hands shook as he began feeding rounds into the weapon, his fingers fumbling the first few before muscle memory took over and the motion smoothed. The line took shape with each positioning, each soldier finding their place in the structure. They moved like pieces of a machine assembling itself, each knowing their function without being told. A sergeant positioned 3 soldiers in a cluster that would provide suppressing fire. Another group established a fallback position, 5 meters behind the first line, ready to cover retreat that wouldn't come because there was nowhere left to retreat to. The Major moved along the line, his stocky figure passing between positions, speaking to soldiers with certainty that made Davrin's chest feel lighter. Close enough now to hear specific words. "We hold this line. For Cadia." Not shouting, just projecting, each syllable clear and certain, tone absolutely confident despite everything burning around them. His hands gestured as he spoke, pointing to positions that needed reinforcement, indicating angles of fire, his movements economical and precise. The cigar never left his mouth, its ember glowing brighter when he drew breath to speak. A guardsman to the Major's right fumbled his gun while trying to check its charge, the weapon slipping from hands made clumsy by exhaustion or fear or both. The Major caught it before it hit stone, his hand finding the grip automatically, checking the charge himself before handing it back. The guardsman's grip tightened, his posture straightening slightly. Hector remained at the line's center, the colors held high despite arms that had to be burning by now. The banner caught what little wind existed, fabric snapping, drawing eyes across the muster field. Soldiers saw it, and moved toward it, drawn by something older than tactics, something written into Cadian genetics by 10,000 years of conditioning. The colors meant the line held, meant someone still commanded, meant there was a place to stand when standing felt impossible. These weren't elite soldiers. Davrin's vision tracked them, catalogued their equipment, assessed their capabilities with cognition, trained to evaluate combat effectiveness. Standard guns, without the hotshots penetrating power. Flak armor that would stop shrapnel if they were lucky, but offered no protection against bolt rounds. No carapace suits, no biological enhancements, no juvenat treatments or combat drug regimens. No Sea Eagle brands marking them as chosen, no additional training. Just regular shock troopers with basic equipment, assembling into a line. The Chaos Marines advancing across the western field would cut through them like chain axes through flesh. The demon engines would scatter them. Acanthos would butcher them, and orbital strike would vaporize everyone in minutes, regardless of what choices they made now. But they took their positions anyway, checked their guns, settled behind inadequate cover, and established firing lanes. One soldier adjusted his helmet 3 times in 10 seconds, fingers finding the strap, tightening it, releasing it, tightening again. Another kept glancing at the sky where the will of eternity hung overhead, his gaze pulled upward involuntarily before discipline forced it back down to his lane. The major's voice carried across the assembling line. "Steady! Check your firing lanes. Watch your spacing." Commanding as if victory remained possible, as if the warp cannon wasn't charging overhead, as if the mathematics worked in their favor. His tone never wavered, never showed doubt, absolute certainty radiating from him in waves that soldiers responded to, despite knowing better. Because sometimes you needed someone to tell you where to die so you could stop running and face it standing. The line formed solid now, perhaps a few hundred guardsmen stretched across the muster field's eastern edge. Their guns tracked the approaching chaos forces, fingers resting against triggers. Behind them, the major stood with Hector holding the colors, the banner bright against smoke and violet sky. They stood ready, waiting for whatever came next, professional despite inadequate gear, disciplined despite terror. And at its center, the major's voice rang out one final time before the assault hit. "For Cadia, hold this line." The certainty in his tone made it sound like an order they could actually follow. Another voice came from somewhere in the line's center, anonymous, just one soldier among 100, his words carrying no more authority than anyone else's. But they cut through the chaos like a power sword. "Cadia stands." Silence followed for perhaps 2 heartbeats, the words hanging suspended. There was a moment, a space created by those words that spoke to each and every person holding that line. Another voice took it up, a different soldier, a different section of the line. "Cadia stands." Then 3 more together, their timing ragged but their volume building. The words spread like fire through dry kindling, soldier to soldier, position to position. This was raw, thunderous, defiant, each voice finding the phrase independently and adding to it anyway. 10 soldiers shouting became 20, became 50, the sound building like pressure in a sealed container, growing until it exceeded what the muster field should contain. "Cadia stands." 100 throats giving voice to the phrase together, the words crashing over the battlefield in waves that made the air itself vibrate. Davrin felt it through his cracked armor, through his chest. The sound wasn't coordinated, wasn't disciplined. Some soldiers shouted it fast, others drew it out, timing scattered across seconds. But the volume compensated for lack of harmony. It was raw defiance. The Chaos Marines' advance slowed, just slightly, just enough to notice. Davrin's vision caught the hesitation. the way their formation compressed briefly as if reassessing what they faced. This shouldn't matter. Words didn't stop bolter rounds, defiance didn't penetrate ceramite, shouting accomplished nothing tactical, but the advance slowed anyway. The chant built rhythm now, soldiers finding synchronization, each repetition landing harder than the last. Davrin watched the guardsman nearest him, 20 years old perhaps, his flak armor missing its left pauldron, his gun showing scorch marks from firing. The soldier's face had been slack with terror 30 seconds ago, eyes too wide, breathing too fast. Now he shouted the phrase with his entire body, throat working, veins standing out on his neck, hands gripping his gun tight enough to make the metal creak. Hector stood at the line's center, the colors gripped in both hands, his own voice joining the chant. Davrin had heard the story, knew the phrase had originated with Kel during a Vox transmission, that he'd actually shouted, "Cadia stands united," before the transmission cut mid-word. The accident had become legend, the truncated phrase spreading across the battlefield, faster than any coordinated communication could carry it. Soldiers had taken it up without knowing its origin, made it their own through repetition until it stopped being Hector's words and became everyone's. Now Hector shouted it with the rest of them, his voice hoarse but clear, adding to the thunder his phrase had created. The banner above him snapped in wind that seemed to respond to the sound, fabric whipping harder with each repetition, the aquila bright against violet sky. Cadia stands. The sound rolled across the burning fortress, carrying through corridors and over walls, reaching places where individual words couldn't penetrate, but the thunder of collective defiance could. The major stood at the line's center, his cigar glowing orange, his own voice adding to the chant. He'd given them a line to hold, a position to defend, orders that made tactical sense. But this phrase, this belonged to the soldiers themselves. Davrin moved forward toward an empty position between two guardsmen who were holding a second line of defense. The soldier to his right couldn't have been more than 20, his face still carrying the softness that years of service would eventually wear away. His flak armor hung loose on his frame, as if he hadn't quite grown into it yet. Purple eyes tracked Davrin's approach, widening slightly as they took in the carapace armor, cracked and scorched, but still unmistakably Caserkin issue. The young guardsman's posture shifted immediately. His spine straightened, shoulders pulling back, the slouch of exhaustion replaced by something approaching proper stance, his weapon coming up from where it had been drifting downward. The change rippled through his entire body, tension replacing the loose despair that had been settling into his limbs. Davrin felt the weight of that response. The young soldier wasn't straightening because orders demanded it, wasn't adopting proper stance because an officer watched. He was trying to match what he thought a Caserkin should be standing beside. "What's your name?" Davrin's voice came rough through his helmet speakers, the Vox system damaged enough that static accompanied every word. The guardsman's throat worked, swallowing before finding words. "Mikhail, sir. Trooper Mikhail Wren, Cadian, 252nd. I'm not an officer, Mikhail. Just another soldier holding the line. There's no need to call me, sir." Davrin shifted position slightly, closing the gap between them by 1/2 meter, close enough that Mikhail could see details through the smoke and violet light, the cracks across Davrin's chest plate, the scorch marks on his pauldrons, the way his armor showed damage that suggested hours of sustained combat. Mikhail's gaze caught on the Sea Eagle brand, visible at Davrin's neck seal, the mark partially obscured by dried blood, but still clear enough to identify. His purple eyes widened further, mouth opening slightly before discipline closed it. "You're Caserkin." "I am." Davrin nodded at the young man. It was a warm gesture given the circumstances, a nod that let the guardsman know that Davrin knew the situation did not look good for them, but that they would hold the line and be okay with the result. Mikhail's eyes showed a flash of resolve as his jaw clenched. His breathing steadied slightly. The terror didn't leave his face entirely, but something shifted underneath the fear. Davrin's hands moved across his equipment, checking connections and charge levels. His fingers found Vaughn's power sword at his waist, the grip warm against his palm through his glove. "Check your lasgun's charge," Davrin said, his tone carrying the same certainty Vaughn had used when commanding their fire team. That calm, professional voice. "Make sure your power pack connection is seated properly. We're going to need every shot." Mikhail responded immediately, his hands moving to check his weapon, despite having checked it 30 seconds earlier. The motion gave him something to do, occupied his shaking hands with familiar tasks. "Pack's good," Mikhail reported, his voice steadier now, falling into the rhythm of military communication. "Charge at 70%. Sights are off by maybe half a degree to the right, but I've been compensating." "Good." Davrin's gaze swept their position, assessing the cover available. It was minimal. They were currently behind a metal barrier with rubble, offering additional positions for fallback if needed. "When they hit us, stay behind the barrier. Aim for mass. Don't try for headshots unless you've got a clear opportunity. Concentrated fire matters more than individual accuracy." Mikhail nodded, his purple eyes tracking Davrin's gestures, absorbing instruction. Learning, even now, even with minutes until assault. The teaching instinct was pure Cadian. You drilled doctrine until the moment combat started. Reinforced training through every available second. Because the difference between survival and death often came down to whether a soldier remembered their training, when fear tried to override everything else. Around them, the line continued forming, standard guardsmen taking positions, officers moving between soldiers to check gear and instructions. The major's voice carrying across the muster field with commands that made impossible defense sound achievable. The chant of Cadia stands had faded, but its echo remained in how soldiers held themselves, spines straightened, weapons gripped with renewed purpose. Davrin felt Mikhail's presence beside him. He felt an odd responsibility for the man's safety now. The young guardsman had straightened because Kasurkin armor suggested strength, had steadied because he thought that Davrin knew how to survive what approached, had found courage he hadn't possessed moments ago because someone whose Sea Eagle brand stood beside him. "Stay close to me, Mikhail," Davrin said, his lasgun raised in low ready. "We're going to hold this line." Mikhail's response came firmer now. "We hold the line." The Chaos Marines came across the muster field like a tide of corruption and ancient hatred, their advance seeming reckless, as none of the warriors seemed to be using cover. They simply advanced. Ocanthos led them, his demon wings spread wide and wafting smoke and ash around him. Behind the demon prince Chaos, berserkers charged forwards alongside a seemingly endless tide of cultists and corrupted human soldiers. Sounds built in layers, the thrum of demon engines' furnace hearts, deep notes felt through armor and bone, chain axes shrieking as they revved to combat speed, the measured hammer of corrupted boots striking stone in marching rhythms. Davrin tracked the closest targets through his gun's sights, waiting for the order to fire. Beside him, Mikhail's breathing came fast and shallow, the young guardsman's terror audible in each ragged inhalation. The line held position, more than 100 guardsmen with weapons tracking the approaching enemy, professional discipline maintaining firing lanes despite hands that shook and eyes that wanted to look anywhere except what advanced toward them. 150 meters. The major's voice cut across the vox net, calm as if commanding a training exercise. "Steady, Hold your fire. Wait for my command. The berserkers accelerated, their advance transforming from march into charge. Crimson armor caught violet light from the eye overhead, brass icons and skull trophies visible, even at distance. They came fast, momentum building with each stride. Some went bareheaded, faces twisted into expressions that might have been rage or agony or religious ecstasy. Others wore helmets whose eye lenses glowed with internal fire, cables feeding directly into spine connections. 100 meters. Davrin's keen eyes tracked individual targets, his cognition processing threat assessments automatically. A lead berserker showing recent repair work across chestplate. Another with chain axe dripping something that hissed, striking ground. A third warrior larger than the rest, armor so ancient, its style predated current patterns. Kill marks carved in languages humanity had forgotten. 75 meters. Mikhail's lasgun barrel traced small circles, the young guardsman fighting to keep it steady. His purple eyes stayed forward despite his fear. They stayed locked on approaching targets, his professional discipline holding, despite terror that made his entire body shake. Around them, the line waited, fingers resting against triggers, breathing hard inside helmets, professional soldiers who knew what approached and stood anyway. 50 meters, close enough now to see details that made Davrin's mind scream warnings, corruption, visible in the faces and bodies of the enemy. One warrior's chest plate had been breached entirely, ribs visible through the gap, but it ran at full speed without slowing. The command came to fire, and the line erupted. 100 las guns opening up in concentrated volleys, bolts punching through air that ionized and crackled. Heavy bolters hammered out bursts, autocannons adding their distinctive bark. The combined firepower transformed the space between defensive line and charging enemy into a killing field where air itself seemed to burn. Every cubic meter crossed by multiple rounds seeking flesh. Davrin's lasgun kicked against his shoulder, the familiar recoil settling into muscles that had absorbed it 10,000 times. His first shot took a berserker in the helmet's eye lens, the round punching through corrupted crystal and into brain case behind. The warrior's head snapped back, momentum arrested mid-stride, body hitting ground and tumbling forward from speed it had been carrying. One shot, one kill. His second shot caught another berserker's neck seal, finding the gap where helmet met chestplate. The round penetration, breaching both layers and severing whatever critical systems ran through that connection point. The warrior went down in a spray of fluids that might have been blood or coolant or both, armor sparking as systems failed. The third shot aimed at a cultist, a chestplate weak point where earlier damage showed, the hotshot round exploiting the breach and detonating something inside. The cultist came apart, torso erupting outward as ammunition or power systems cooked off. The first wave of the advancing enemy seemed to be made up of chaff, human soldiers and cultists who were likely being used to absorb ammunition and cause chaos. As this fragile enemy wave hit the front row of cover, the Voxnet screamed with casualty reports. Positions 3 through 7 were overrun, where berserkers closed to melee range. Position 12 had gone silent, its icon blinking red on tactical displays. The line held in places, buckled in others, standard guardsmen firing disciplined volleys that continued to drop the lesser armored enemy, adding their fire to the concentrated defense. Davrin shot and added his own fire to a volley of rounds that took a berserker through the chest, the armor failing under multiple rounds. He continued to fire into the advancing enemy, the muzzle of his gun growing hot as it rested on the metal barrier to steady his aim. He caught a cultist mid-leap, the warrior falling short of its target and crushing a pile of rubble beneath it. He fired until his lasgun's power pack went dead, the indicator shifting from amber to red. Davrin dropped the depleted pack and reloaded. A cultist closed on their position, axe raised, its roar shaking the air. Davrin leaned forward into a shooting stance and fired 2 quick shots center mass. The enemy fell, making Mikhail flinch. The young man was adding his own fire to the chaos. While he didn't share Davrin's accuracy, he was hitting shots that slowed or stopped bodies as they moved forwards. The enemy force was now well and truly upon them. While they were thinned by the heavy weapons and volleys of rifles, their numbers allowed the fastest to crash upon the front barricades. It was during this wave that 2 cultists broke through to Davrin's position. One jumped their barricade to the left, taking Davrin by surprise and knocking the gun from his hand. He rolled from the advancing enemy and drew Vaughn's power sword before charging. The blades met with impact that jarred through his arms, through his shoulders, into his cracked ribs where pain lanced through his side. But the power sword held, its edge biting into the chain axe's teeth, the cultist's momentum arrested. Davrin twisted, redirecting force rather than opposing it, the counter-strike Vaughn had executed in his final moment. His blade found the gap at the neck, sliding through corrupted flesh, and whatever systems kept the warrior functioning. The power sword carved clean through, the head separating from shoulders, body collapsing forward, even as blood fountained upward. The second cultist charged from Davrin's right, moving faster than his damaged body could track. He brought the power sword around, the blade catching the warrior mid-chest, cutting through what minimal armor the man had on. The cultist went down in 2 pieces, bisected by the monomolecular edge, its top half crawling forward, still trying to reach him before systems finally failed. The blade's energy field flickered once, twice, died completely. The humming stopped, the blue crackling faded, leaving Davrin holding an expensive weapon whose monomolecular edge had gone inert. He stared at it for half a second before dropping it to maglock at his thigh. A lasgun lay 5 meters distant, dropped by a guardsman who'd fallen defending this position. It was a standard M36. The power pack indicator showed 40% charge. Davrin's hands found it automatically. Another berserker charged their position, coming at them from the front lines. Davrin raised the gun, sighted through iron sights and squeezed the trigger. The recoil felt lighter and less authoritative than his old weapon, and the rounds did much less damage to the advancing Marine. Davrin fired again and again, each shot placing exactly where training said they should, but the standard weapon's penetration was insufficient against corrupted ceramite. Mikhail's shots joined his, the young guardsman firing controlled bursts from behind the barrier. His aim was good, better than Davrin expected, each shot landing within handspan of the others, grouping tight despite his shaking hands. But the M36's rounds scraped across the berserker's armor without penetrating, sparks flying where bolts struck. The berserker closed to 10 meters, 5. Its chain axe raised, roaring, victory certain. Then the major's autocannon opened up from the line's center, 3-round burst catching the warrior center mass. The heavier rounds punched through where lasfire had failed, detonating inside corrupted flesh. The berserker's arm was torn from a socket as it stumbled, fell, slid forward on momentum until it stopped 3 meters from their position. Davrin's hands stayed steady on the M36, his finger still on the trigger, the weapon feeling simultaneously familiar and foreign. He'd trained with standard lasguns since he was a boy, had carried them through White Shield and his early shock trooper service before Kasurkin selection. But a decade of hotshot weapons had changed his expectations, his muscle memory calibrated for superior penetration and enhanced accuracy. The line was holding for the most part, but not everywhere. Positions continued falling on the flanks where berserkers broke through, where demon engines crushed defenders beneath blade limbs. But here, at the center where the Major commanded and Hector held the colors, the defensive structure remained intact. Concentrated fire from dozens of lasguns brought down Chaos Marines that individual shots couldn't touch. Heavy weapons found targets, autocannons and heavy bolters adding their weight to the defense. And guardsmen kept shooting, kept holding their positions, kept standing, despite watching brothers fall. "We're holding!" Mikhail's voice came over Squad Vox, disbelief and pride mixing together. The young guardsman's terror transformed into something approaching hope. His gun kept firing, disciplined bursts targeting the next wave approaching. His aim steady now despite hands that had been shaking moments ago. Davrin's own weapon kicked against his shoulder. His shots joined hundreds of others converging on enemies whose advance had finally, impossibly, slowed under weight of fire they couldn't simply absorb and ignore. After some time, the line was holding by fragments, ammunition running low enough that officers called for disciplined fire. Conserve your shots, make every round count. Davrin's own weapon showed 20% charge, the indicator pulsing amber in time with his heartbeat. Around him, guardsmen checked their power packs with movements growing desperate, fingers fumbling connections, finding reserves that wouldn't last another sustained assault. Mikhail's lasgun had dropped to 15%, the young guardsman's face showing understanding that reality had finally caught up, that the next wave would be the last they could answer with fire. Ocanthos gathered his forces across the killing field. Demon wings spread wide enough to cast shadows that swallowed entire squads. His roar carried across 200 meters and casting fear into the men of the line. Behind the demon prince, what remained of the Hounds of Abaddon, perhaps 30 berserkers, whose armor showed damage from sustained fire, but who kept coming. Demon engines prowled the flanks, where, up to this point, they had been kept at bay by heavy weapons and explosive teams. This was the final push. Davrin felt it in how they assembled, saw it in how Ocanthos positioned himself at the spearhead, rather than commanding from behind. This assault would break the line, and the demon prince had chosen to lead it personally. Minutes until they charged, maybe seconds. Beside him, Mikhail breathed fast and shallow, his purple eyes locked forward, body trembling with exhaustion and terror. Across the line, guardsmen settled into positions they'd die defending, checking equipment one final time, finding whatever courage remained in places discipline couldn't reach. Then, without warning, the sky split above them. Golden light washed over the battlefield, seeming to push right through the smoke that choked the air. Many of the defending guard looked up, shielding their eyes in an attempt to see what had appeared above their position. She descended through the golden wound in reality, her armor blazing with radiance. Saint Celestine. Davrin's mind recognized her through stories he'd heard since childhood, through litanies and prayers, and tales of miracles that had always felt distant, metaphorical, not something you witnessed with your own eyes. But here she came, wings of pure light spreading behind her, the ardent blade raised high and burning with fire that wasn't fire, her halo casting illumination that pushed back the violet wash from the eye overhead. The light reached Davrin's skin through his armor, through ceramite and body glove, warmth soaking into flesh that had been operating on nothing but momentum and fading discipline. His breathing deepened automatically. The wave of faith felt physical, tangible, real as any force Davrin had felt in a decade of combat. It washed over the line, settling into chests and straightening spines. Not metaphorical, not psychological. His body responded before his mind understood why. Muscles that had been failing finding new reserves, exhaustion that should have collapsed him, pushed back by warmth spreading from his core, outward, through limbs. Guardsmen across the line felt it too. Davrin watched their postures shift, shoulders pulling back, weapons coming up from where they'd been downward. Mikhail beside him straightened completely, his purple eyes widening, terror transformed into something approaching awe. The young guardsman's hands stopped shaking entirely. Even Space Marines responded. The Black Templars at Martyr's Rampart, just about visible in the distance through smoke and fire, raised their weapons in salute. These warriors who believed in the Emperor's divinity more fervently than most, who'd spent 8 days fighting with zealous fury, even they paused, watching the living saint descend, their rigid doctrine finding validation in golden light that pushed back darkness. Davrin believed. The Emperor had sent help. The golden light washing over him felt like answer to prayers he hadn't known how to voice, like validation that standing had mattered after all, like proof that defiance measured beyond its tactical utility. Celestine landed in the muster field's center, her armored boots striking stone with impact that sent ripples through the ground Davrin felt through his own boots. The ardent blade burned in her grip, its fire casting everything in gold. Her armor showed damage, scorch marks across the chest plate, dents along the pauldrons, and other signs of combat wear. She'd been fighting before arriving here, had come from some other desperate battle to reach them. Celestine's gaze swept the defensive line, her eyes carrying light that seemed to see through armor and flesh both, finding what lived underneath. Davrin felt that attention pass over him briefly, warmth intensifying for a moment before moving on. Recognition, maybe, or acknowledgement, or simply the blessing of being seen by something holy when you'd expected only death. The golden light pressed back against violet corruption overhead, reality solidifying where it had been growing thin. The will of eternity still promised orbital annihilation. But for this moment, this impossible, miraculous moment, the darkness retreated slightly, gave ground to illumination that shouldn't exist, but blazed anyway. Ocanthos roared challenge across the killing field, his demon voice promising violence and blood and skulls for Khorne's throne. But the roar carried less weight than before, sound breaking against golden light that pushed back where darkness had pressed forward, unopposed. The assault would come. The situation still promised impossible odds and certain death. But the line held with strength, borrowed from radiance, and Davrin believed, for the first time since that crater, since watching his brothers die, that maybe, impossibly, defiance mattered more than odds. The Emperor protects. The phrase had always felt distant, abstract, something you said because doctrine required it. Now it burned in Davrin's chest like warmth, like certainty, like golden light made internal. His finger found his trigger, ready to add his remaining ammunition to whatever came next. For now, the line held. The Emperor had sent help, and they would make that help matter. Then came the sounds of engines cutting through atmosphere with a distinctive scream that sounded like rapid descent. Landing craft were falling from above, pushing against the boundaries of safe entry speeds. Davrin's hearing tracked the approach through smoke and violet light, counting ships by engine signatures. Multiple contacts, perhaps a dozen, descending toward the muster field's eastern edge, where the line held position. The ships broke through the cloud layer, their hulls showing damage and scorched metal. Armor plates missing along port sides, engines trailing smoke that streamed behind them in black ribbons. Void shields flickering with each atmospheric impact. These weren't fresh reinforcements from orbit. These were survivors, vessels that had fought their way through hell itself to reach this burning fortress. They landed hard, retro thrusters firing at maximum to arrest momentum that threatened to carry them through the muster field entirely. Stone cracked under their landing gear, the impacts sending vibrations through ground that Davrin felt in his legs. Assault ramps dropped before the ships finished settling, hydraulics screaming as they forced damaged mechanisms to function one final time. Battle Sisters poured forth singing. The hymn carried across the muster field with clarity that cut through all bolter fire and demon roars. 500 voices raised in harmonies. The sisters emerged in formation despite their rapid deployment, their movements coordinated through years of drilling, black armor trimmed in crimson. Their bolters came up as they advanced, the weapons tracking targets. Fresh troops, these sisters moved without hesitation, without the small pauses that came from operating on depleted reserves, without the tremor in weapon handling that marked soldiers who'd been fighting for 6 hours straight. Their armor showed damage from whatever battles they'd survived to reach here, but their movements carried energy that Kaza Craft's defenders had burned through hours ago. The hymn built layers as more sisters deployed, voices joining the harmony and counterpoint that created something transcendent. The words carried in High Gothic, formal liturgy mixing with battle cant, praise to the Emperor woven through promises of violence against his enemies. The sound settled into Davrin's bones, vibrating through armor and flesh both, adding to warmth spreading from his core. Their bolters opened up, the distinctive bark cutting through other sounds, sharp, authoritative, each shot placed with intent. Mass reactive rounds found Chaos Marines across the western killing field, detonating on impact. They smashed into the Chaos flank with momentum that broke the Berserkers' formation. I've 100 sisters in black and crimson armor carving through an enemy that had seemed unstoppable a moment ago. Their chainswords screamed, their flamers painted everything orange, their faith manifesting as something tangible that pushed back against corruption, the way golden light pushed back violet darkness. The tide turned. Davrin watched it happen across the muster field, saw the chaos advance falter and slow and begin retreating for the first time since the assault began. The berserkers who'd been preparing final charge scattered under concentrated bolter fire, their formation dissolving into individual warriors seeking cover. Demon engines that had prowled the flanks turned to face this new threat, adjusting targeting as fresh enemies presented themselves. Mikhail's voice came over the new sounds of battle, carrying wonder and hope that replaced the terror that had lived there for hours. The Emperor protects. He does, keep firing, Davrin said, his voice carrying certainty that surprised him. The golden light washing over the battlefield felt like validation, like proof that standing had mattered, like answer to questions he hadn't known how to ask. The sisters' hymn continued building. Their advance never slowed, never hesitated, black armor and crimson trim moving through smoke and fire. They sang while they killed, praised while they purged, their devotion manifesting as physical force that pushed back corruption wherever it tried to take root. Fresh troops against exhausted enemy. The Chaos Marines had been fighting for days, pushing through fortress defenses, sustaining casualties that would have broken mortal formations hours ago. But even post-human physiology had limits. Even warriors who'd survived countless battles could be worn down through attrition. The sisters hit them at that moment of depletion. Their assault intensified as the guardsmen of the line fired into the flanks of the retreating enemy. The retreat was not a run. Khorne's chosen didn't flee, but they fell back to defensive positions, their advance broken by fire they couldn't simply absorb and ignore. Demon engines tried to hold ground, carving through sisters who got too close, but concentrated bolter fire found weak points in their demon metal hides, rounds detonating inside furnace hearts. Davrin himself kept firing, his shots joining hundreds of others. His 20% charge depleted slowly, conserved through discipline that had returned with faith, each shot placed with care. Mikhail beside him fired with steady hands, his terror transformed into something useful, channeled into faith that made him much more effective. The young guardsman's purple eyes tracked targets, his weapon flashing in controlled bursts. The sisters' hymn never stopped, never wavered. Their faith washed over Davrin like the golden light had. The Emperor protects. And for this moment, impossibly, he did.